Everybody, welcome to our teach-in on electrifying New York's transportation and the key legislation that's going to get us there. We have some terrific speakers today and delighted to see all of the people joining. You probably already know this, but if you have any questions, you can just enter them into the Q&A, which is down at the bottom bar on the right of your screen. Or in the chat, but it's easier if you put it in the Q&A for us to access later. And I will now just pass it off to my colleague, Michaela, who's gonna let you know who the speakers are. You probably already know, that's why you're here, but we've got some really great minds gathered today to share the bills that we need to pass in order to expedite the electrification of New York's transportation sector, which, as many of you know, is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State, the transportation sector. So we really need to address it, and we need to do so as quickly as possible. So that's why we're here, and we're going to power through. I'll pass it off to Mick.
Thanks, Betta. Hi, everyone. I'm Michaela Shabako, the program coordinator with New Yorkers for Clean Power. And we have, again, a great line of speakers today. We'll start off with Albert Gore, who is the Director of Public Policy and Business Development at Tesla, talking about the legislation to allow the direct sales of electric vehicles in New York at New York retail locations. And then Carine Dumit from the Director of Market Development and Public Policy at EVgo, talking about commercial EV charging rates. And then Mo-Yain, Tham, and Rachel Patterson. Mo-Yain is from the Jobs to Move America as the Policy and Research Associate, and Rachel Patterson is the Legislative and Climate Associate at Environmental Advocates of New York. And they will run us through a package of bills for green transit and green jobs. And we also have a general take action for all of these bills. We'll put that information in the chat and also in the follow-up after this teach-in, but we have a form if you're interested in meeting with your assembly member or senator talking about advancing these clean transportation bills. You can fill out that form and we'll get in touch with you on how to set a meeting like that up. And we'll mention that again at the end of the teach-in and talk about that more. So without further ado, I'll hand it off to Albert.
Thanks so much, Michaela, and thanks to you and Betta for having me, and thanks everybody for joining. So the bills that I'm talking about today are Senate Bill 1763 from Ty Kaminsky and Assembly Bill 4614 from Assembly Member Pat Fahey, and they are companion bills moving through the legislature this year that address the existing New York constraint on direct sales of electric vehicles by electric vehicle manufacturers. So Tesla has always sold vehicles directly. We've never sold through a franchise dealer anywhere in the world. There are several reasons for that. The most important reason is as a new technology, going back, over a decade, we actually opened our first store in New York in 2009. The sales experience was really focused on overcoming the barriers to adoption of electric vehicles. Most people still today, when they come into a store, are considering buying an EV for the first time. And so it's a much different buying experience than going into a traditional dealership, where in most cases the sale happens that day. We used to track a metric of how many days between when a customer first came into the store and when they finally decided to purchase, which was over 33 days. This was about a 6-year-old stat, but so the stores are really set up in the same way that Apple set up their stores initially. It's very low pressure environment. You're sort of free to come in and demonstrate the products. and ask as many questions as you want. And the benefit to our model is that pricing is completely uniform and fixed, so that whether you're on the website or you're in a store, the price is the same, and there's no layers of negotiation the way that there are at a traditional dealership. And that's worked really well for us. There are new entrants to the market now, like Rivian and Lucid Motors, that also only manufacture electric vehicles and are also choosing to sell directly. And we Tesla are limited in New York to having 5 stores. These new companies are completely blocked from opening any stores in New York. And that's a result of a 2014 law that was passed basically with the intention of blocking Tesla from expanding any further. Between 2009 and 2014, we had opened 5 stores. There was some litigation. Actually, the Auto Dealer Association sued the New York DMV for, in their view, for breaking the law by granting our license applications, our sales license applications. They lost that lawsuit. It went all the way to the New York Supreme Court. And the court ruled that the law at the time very clearly allowed a manufacturer that did not have franchise dealers to sell directly. So they came back the following year in 2014 and passed a law that created the current situation. So for us, we've changed a lot since 2014. We've grown a lot. We were a very low volume manufacturer back then of relatively expensive cars. We've now reduced the purchase price of our lowest priced offering by 73% over the last 9 years. We have a $35,000 car, which is below the average purchase price of a car in the United States. But we're still focused on bringing the price down further, because that's the primary barrier to adoption for most folks. And so we've also, we manufactured 500,000 cars last year. So we're really focused on expanding deployment, but still limited to that 2014 footprint of 5 stores. As a result, New York is a severely underserved market for Tesla, and also for these new manufacturers. I mean, we've got more demand than we can serve in New York State, and that's a function of, I think, the way that New York State and the country as a whole has changed as well since 2014. You had an existing zero-emission vehicle target in 2014 when New York became a ZEV state, of 2 million EVs on the road by 2030. We're only about 3% of the way there. But with the passage of CLCPA, significant investments in charging infrastructure, there is now enormous demand, and more New Yorkers are considering an electric vehicle for their next vehicle purchase. Also, I want to emphasize, decarbonizing transportation sector is hugely important. It's the biggest contributor to emissions, and within transportation, light duty vehicles are the biggest, or they're 61% of transportation emissions. But it's not the only way to reduce transportation emissions. So reducing demand for transportation and smart growth policies and massive investments in public transportation is maybe the most important thing we can do. But to the extent we are looking to transition on-road vehicles from gas cars to EVs, this is a really important policy. Direct sales account for about 80% of the battery electric vehicle sales in New York. And that number is true nationally as well. We hope that goes down, and really encouraged by the commitments from other automakers to make the majority or all of their offerings zero emission over the next 15 years. But to hit the goals that we need to hit by 2050, we need action starting right now. And the companies that really are selling the majority of EVs, the vast majority of EVs in New York, are constrained, and that seems to be really out of sync with the broader policy goals of New York State. So what the bill does is it takes the law from 2014, which basically said DMV can't issue any new licenses to any manufacturer to sell cars. It can renew the 5 that Tesla has, but we couldn't. It's not like we could give one of these licenses to Rivian or Lucid even if we wanted to. We can only renew the ones that we have. So it would basically allow DMV to issue sales licenses to manufacturers that only manufacture electric vehicles and that do not sell through franchise dealers in New York State. So that's something that I think protects existing franchise dealers from what they would characterize as unfair methods of competition by their franchisors, like Ford and GM, but allowing companies that want to sell and service vehicles directly to do so. There are some, interesting statistics, I think, just to highlight the importance of this issue as it relates to EV deployment. One thing that I've tried to highlight is the comparison to a state like Florida, which has a similar population, about 20 million people, a little over 20 million, but none of the supportive policies that exist in New York State. New York has a ZEV mandate. New York has the CLCPA targets. It has an EV rebate that is fairly generous for cars under a certain MSRP, but it has this limit of five stores for a fairly big state. Florida has no ZEV mandate, no emissions reductions targets, no EV incentives, but they're an open market. We've got 16 stores in New York State. As a result, we've sort of grown in keeping with demand over the last decade there. So anywhere you are in the state of Florida, if you want to buy online or at a store, it's very easy to do it. And as a result, we've got twice as many cars on the road there, and we sell at about a 65% greater annual rate in Florida than we do in New York. That is something that I think it's out of step with all of the progress New York's made. It's got the strongest state climate law in the country, and this policy exists in 19 other states where there's not this constraint on our ability to grow and make it easier for people to buy EVs. And so we think it's a perfect time to address it. We're working with Rivian and Lucid, a number of other groups, actually 108 different environmental groups from around the state have signed on to a letter of support for this bill, including big statewide organizations like Environmental Advocates and NRDC and Sierra Club, and then a lot of smaller regional and local organizations that are supportive of this bill. So happy to answer any questions in the follow-up, but I will introduce my friend and former colleague, Carine. We worked together going back 6 years to Solar City, working on solar policy. So I'm really happy to be the one to introduce Carine.
Very kind of you, Al. Thank you so much. And it's great to share the virtual stage with you here, and Mo-Yain as well as Rachel. And again, thank you very much for Michaela and Betta for hosting us today. And thanks for everyone for joining. There's certainly a lot of really exciting things happening, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to talk about rate design. So I have, not to make it, I have a couple of slides that I could share with folks. If Michaela, you wouldn't mind just putting those up. Thanks so much. So we can go to slide 2. I will just start by highlighting, sharing a few highlights about EVgo. and who we are, just to kind of set the stage. We're the nation's largest public fast charging network with more than 800 locations across 34 states in 67 metro areas. We develop, finance, own and operate and maintain public fast charging stations in partnership with and partner with automakers, fleets, and rideshare operators, as well as retail hosts such as hotels, shopping centers, gas stations, parking lots, etc. And other stakeholders to deploy advanced charging technology to expand network availability and make it easier for all Americans to enjoy the benefits of an EV. And we're committed to providing a reliable charging experience and doing our part to accelerate the transition to clean electrification nationwide. Next slide, please. Just to kind of remind folks, there's a variety of charging technologies, level 1, level 2, level 3. I think most folks are probably familiar with those. So I think I can skip that one and maybe get into the meat of things here. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the early stages of EV infrastructure deployment, DC fast charging was viewed as purely a solution to assuage the range anxiety of single-family homeowners, especially on trips between cities and across the country. And as a result, much early on in the DCFC deployment, much of that was focused on high-traffic transit corridors, service plazas, and rest areas along interstates and along major highways. But DCFC offers more than just a corridor use case, in that fast chargers play an important role in dense urban and suburban areas where not every home has a driveway or an attached garage, or drivers don't have a dedicated parking space. And in fact, a January 2019 white paper released by the International Climate on Clean Transportation indicated that more than half of the EV owning apartment dwellers in the US rely on public fast charging sites for their charging needs. Next slide, please. So in addition to personal use drivers, DC fast charging also provides for fast and convenient charging for light duty fleets, especially in rideshare and delivery applications. So drivers who participate in the gig economy having access to quick and reliable fast charging is very important. And since light duty fleet vehicles drive on average 3 to 7 times more than personal use drivers, they need access to that, where it is located around amenities so that the time that they spend on charging aligns with breaks for food or restrooms to really allow the driver to get back on the road. So it's important to consider the multitude of use cases and applications in charging and recognize the uniqueness of each charging type, as I mentioned, level 1, level 2, and DCFC. And so New York has committed to aggressive climate objectives. I think Al highlighted those, and there's been a lot of work to really advance that from a variety of sectors. And to really achieve those, we really need to take a hard look at some of the structural elements and see how we may align them so that they don't inadvertently undermine the many efforts and programs that are currently underway. And specifically to rate design, I'm going to share one example with you all that you see on this slide on the right-hand side. In Colorado, the Regional Transportation District, the RTD, which is the public transit agency in the Denver area, received funding to make the switch to electric buses, only to find that operating costs due to the demand portion of electricity, of the electricity tariff that they were under, made it nearly 60% more expensive than the diesel fleets. Next slide, please. So you can see how important rate is, and just to kind of maybe do a little bit of a level setting or reminder that so the single biggest ongoing cost for fast charging is the procurement of power. And I think that sometimes folks underestimate both the nameplate electricity rate for commercial EV charging and the effective kilowatt-hour price based on the real fees levied to a charging station by the utility. And so traditional commercial industrial rates, they were originally designed for large buildings rather than public fast charging. And so accordingly, they don't really reflect the unique cost or flexibility of EV charging. And so they present a barrier to EV adoption. And that's, I think, really what I think this is obviously the conversation that is happening in many parts of the country, and it certainly is happening right now in New York with this legislation. So next slide, please. So the good news is that, as I mentioned, legislators, utility and regulators, and the charging industry can work together to ensure that those rate structures, as were traditionally designed, are designed with EV use case in mind, and that are really reflective of the unique characteristics and flexible nature of EV charging, and therefore encourage deployment of fast chargers. Those are some examples of how different utilities across the country have tackled these things. And one thing that I would want to mention here is that there is a variety of ways to address this, and rate reform or rate design can be technology neutral. And we've seen this succeed in different parts of the country. For example, Madison Gas and Electric has a rate that accounts for how much the customer utilizes the system by considering the load factor of that customer, independently of whether it is a fast charging station or any type of other commercial industrial customer. So state legislatures have encouraged utilities to propose rate design. Commissions have encouraged utilities to propose rate design. Utilities have done that as well on their own. And so all of these things are efforts that are really important and are geared to address a core issue within transportation electrification. So I'll get into the exciting part, which is next slide, please. The bill itself that is currently moving through the state legislature. It's Senate Bill 3929, sponsored by Senator Kennedy, Assembly Bill 3876, Assembly Member Cusick. And here what this bill does is that it would have utilities develop and submit for the Public Service Commission's review and public comment alternatives to those traditional commercial demand-based rate structures. And as written, the bill would require consideration for the full range of vehicle classes, as well as consideration for the unique needs of vehicle charging or vehicle fleet operators and other types of use cases, which is really essential. And it addresses obviously a critical public policy concern while maintaining flexibility for utilities to design solutions that work best and work for the uniqueness of their service territory. So it does create this forum for a discussion to address that challenge. And rate design is central to the suite of EV-related policy tools that New York has enabled. I know that a lot of folks, and particularly the Climate Action Council, has dedicated a considerable amount of time and effort in developing recommendations. I know the state legislature and a lot of other stakeholders, policymakers, regulators have and continue to work on programs and policies that advance successful transportation electrification. And this is one core element of that really leverages all of those works. So with that, I will pass it on to Mo-Yain Tham from Jobs to Move America and Rachel Patterson from Environmental Advocates. And this is my contact information on the last slide.
Oh.
Great, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now. So let me get that set up. Nope, not that one.
And while Mo-Yain is doing that, I'll just mention to everybody again that if you have questions, to please put them in the Q&A, and we will have a lively Q&A session after everyone is finished presenting.
Sorry. And maybe Rachel, if you have it up, because for some reason that link, there it is, sorry. Here we go again.
All good.
And share screen, select.
It
It's
says,
not showing.
it says has started. Maybe just like give it a minute after, because
Okay.
it did say has started sharing.
Okay. And I am selecting the correct slide.
Okay, now it's saying that you've started sharing it again. So I think it's working.
There it is.
Yay.
Yay. Just disappeared there for a moment. Sorry, y'all.
Great, thanks.
Great. So happy to get started. My name is Rachel Patterson, and I'm the Legislative and Climate Associate at Environmental Advocates New York. And EANY is a Albany-based environmental advocacy organization that has been helping to advance policies in New York for over 50 years.
Right. And I'm Mo-Yain Tham. I'm the New York researcher at Jobs to Move America. And Jobs to Move America is a strategic policy center focused on making sure our public money goes towards good quality jobs. And the way we do that is through research and organizing, making sure companies that win government contracts provide the maximum public good and also have some form of public accountability included.
And yeah, just want to say thank you to NYCP for hosting this and inviting us to speak on these bills today. Our organizations are both members of the Electrify Ny Coalition, which is a statewide coalition made up of environmental justice, green and labor advocates, and we're focused on the intersection of climate, jobs, and justice. And we help draft legislation and weigh in on important transportation-related policies with the legislature and the state regulatory agencies. And so today, the bills that we would like to talk to you about are the Green Transit, Green Jobs bills. And the idea behind these bills is to help reduce emissions by electrifying buses across the state in all transit agencies and incentivizing job growth through the procurement process and manufacturing of these electric buses. These bills were both introduced in last year's legislative session, but didn't really have the opportunity to move. So we're hoping to change that this year. So the goal of the Green Transit Bill is really to help New York State reach the goals established by the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act that passed in 2019. And I'm sure many of you know that the goals for that are quite aggressive, expected to reduce emissions by 40% by 2030 and 85% by 2050. And as folks on this call have already stated, transportation emissions make up the largest share of any emissions source from any sector in the state. And in addition to the greenhouse gases that are produced, transportation emissions in particular also create co-pollutants, which have really harmful health impacts, particularly are concentrated in communities of color and low-income communities because those tend to be transportation corridors. And so by reducing emissions from heavy-duty, high-emitting vehicles such as buses, we'll not only be able to reach the CLCPA goals, but improve public health along the way.
Right. And then, as Rachel mentioned earlier, the Green Jobs Bill works as part of a package with the Green Transit Bill. So it's a complementary bill. And the idea is that when these transit agencies purchase these electric buses, they go towards high road manufacturers. And the idea is that these state funds would then make sure that the manufacturers are committed to targeted hiring, make sure communities who traditionally aren't manufacturing are prioritized, that they're committed to creating good jobs, and that there's a just transition for fossil fuel industry workers.
And both the Green Transit and the Green Jobs bills are sponsored by Senator Kennedy, who represents Buffalo, and Assemblymember Danowitz, who represents the Syracuse area. So the specifics on the Green Transit bill is that it would require public transit authorities to transition to purchasing only electric vehicles by the year 2029. And this would happen as their buses phase out. So buses do tend to have a lifetime of about 10 to 12 years. And as those buses die, this would just require transit agencies to purchase electric vehicles and their related infrastructure. This bill would also provide funding preference for transit agencies that make a commitment to transition to electric buses?
Right, and then the Green Jobs Bill, the way it works, it uses a best value procurement process or purchasing framework. And the idea is that when the bidders submit proposals to win these contracts, they're committing to these good wages, benefits, training, and retraining. As mentioned earlier, one of the goals is to have a just transition, right? So diesel mechanics would receive retraining to work on electric buses. And also the prioritization of using registered apprenticeship programs. And once again, targeted hiring. So individuals who usually aren't in manufacturing, such as women of color and formerly incarcerated or returning citizens. Also, when possible, the bidders are encouraged to create the jobs in New York State, and also, when possible, to commit to creating facilities in the state as well. And there's a policy tool embedded into the Green Jobs Bill, and it's Jobs to America's policy tool known as the U.S. Employment Plan. And once again, the idea is that it's using a best value framework for the transit agencies to put into their request for proposals for these contracts. And the reason why it's framed as best value is because most government agencies actually are required to use a lowest cost evaluation criteria. I mean, it's government spending your money, right? Taxpayer money. So they're usually, trying to just make sure they're using it effectively and efficiently, and they're going for they award it to the lowest cost bid. In this case, with the best value framework, they can actually give extra credit to the manufacturers who are committed to creating these good jobs and providing extra benefits to the community. And so it creates a clear criteria for evaluation. There's usually a worksheet that the manufacturers would fill out showing how, the number of jobs they're going to create, the wages they're going to provide, the kind of benefits. And once again, it encourages these bidders to compete up, like show how they're adding extra value to the community in addition to these products. It's also a voluntary commitment, so the bidders don't have to fill out the U.S. Employment Plan, but they're encouraged to, right? I mean, it helps them win the bid if they actually show, once again, we're adding extra value to the community if you award us this contract to provide electric buses. Also, it's approved by the U.S. Department of Transportation, so you can use federal funds for it. And an example of how the U.S. Employment Plan has been used in the past, LA Metro used the U.S. Employment Plan in their request for proposals for electric buses, and Proterra won that bid. And part of their USEP commitments was to say, we're going to create jobs in the area. And it turned out that they did have a facility outside of LA. So they're saying, if we win this contract, we could actually create more jobs and hire locally. It also created a pathway to unionization. So in 2019, Proterra signed a union contract with USW, United Steelworkers. And then in 2020, Proterra, USW, and community stakeholders ended up signing a community benefits agreement. And that actually added another layer of community stakeholder accountability. And through that agreement, Proterra ended up creating an apprenticeship program with United Steelworkers. It actually prioritizes like 50% of the community members are part of the apprenticeship program, and also there's a targeted hiring element to it. So community members that are facing barriers to employment are prioritized. And as mentioned, that would normally be people who are formerly incarcerated, people who are veterans, and so forth.
And as we've been going around trying to build support for these bills, we've run into a few things that people are considering challenges. So we just wanted to clarify some of these issues. And the first one that's being cited quite a lot is the cost to transit agencies to purchase electric buses. So while it's true now that electric buses are a bit more expensive than traditional gasoline vehicles, we do see, as with regular EVs, that as the technology improves and as agencies across the nation continue to purchase these buses, that the price does continue to drop. And we do expect to see cost parity sometime in the very near future with the electric buses. And the other consideration is that electric vehicles, as many of you all know, do have overall lower maintenance costs because they require less maintenance and repair over time. So the overall cost of each of the buses is when compared to a diesel bus is less over the lifetime of the vehicle. And we also think that because if this bill does get passed this year, it won't start requiring transit agencies to purchase these electric buses until 2029. So with an 8-year lead time, we do think that that is going to be reasonable enough lead time for transportation agencies to be able to consider this in their budgets. And as I mentioned before, because this would only require new buses to be bought when old buses phase out, it's not as if this is a wide-scale mandate to completely replace all the fleets right now. It's going to be quite a gradual process, which will also help with the affordability for transit agencies.
Right. And so building off of that, it's the same, there's a similar concern around some transit agencies have already purchased alternative fuel buses, such as CNG, compressed natural gas. And so it's the same idea. It's like you can still continue using those buses. It's not this abrupt change. The life cycle of a bus is usually 10 to 12 years. And so as they age out, you can start planning to purchase these electric buses and start committing. The procurement process for most transit agencies usually take about 2 years. So, you know, once they hit their 10-year or 8-year life cycle, the transit agencies can start planning. They can even do pilot programs like just testing out 5 to 10 buses, planning the routes, installing charging infrastructure like the one in the picture. So it gives them time to ease into this process.
And so where is the bill now? So the bills, both of them have been referred to the transportation committees in both the Senate and the Assembly. But what we need is for them to get on an agenda so that they can actually move through the committee process and make it to the floor by June before session ends. And so we already have support from 40 legislators and 12 organizations that have signed on in support of the bill. But we do need your help and support to keep building the momentum here. And so we have a few ways for you to do that. You can send a letter to your legislator asking them to support or co-sponsor both of the bills. And I believe we have an example or oh, boom, I'll let Mo-Yain explain that actually.
Yeah, so as a way to help send a letter to your legislator, if you scan this QR code, it goes to our Action Network site, and it has a sample letter already created, and just add your name, your address, and it'll go to your legislator directly. Yeah, and it looks like Betta's trying it out.
Great, and you can also write a letter to the editor, in particular targeting your local news outlet. We are trying to, at this point, target the transportation chairs so that they see how interested communities are in making this transition. And of course, you can always write a memo of support. You can go to our website to see an example of our memo of support. And please stay tuned. We are considering doing future actions to publicize the bills more so that legislators really do see how important this shift is for New York State. And I believe that's all we have. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. I know QR codes have been around for a while now, but I still just think they're so amazing. And it did work. And Mick, I think, also put it in the chat too. So that's, such great information, really important bills. NYCP is always eager to support anything that supports green jobs and a just transition. And so wanted to be sure to include that as well. And I love your tag teaming presenting there. But, in general, this is just such a great package of transportation legislation. And so in addition to all of the things that Mo-Yain and Rachel just invited you to do, which I also urge you to do, we also wanted to invite you, if you are interested in doing some grassroots lobbying in support of all of these bills, as a package. We are, and Mick already beat me to the punch here, as she always does with her posting in the chat. We've got the form. If you would like to get a little bit more involved beyond this learning session and fill that out, we will help with setting up some meetings with your legislator and providing support so we can, organize to get these bills over the finish line, hopefully this session. So please fill out the form if you'd like to work with us on that. We're happy to arrange the meetings and provide whatever we can in the way of support. So, okay, so please do that. And now I know we have a lot of questions in our Q&A, which is great. Our participants are always on it with asking a lot of great questions. So I will pass it over to Mick to open it up. I know we've answered some, but Mick, where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I thought maybe we could start with some of the questions that Albert actually already answered, just because it will be helpful for the recording to have some of those questions answered live about what direct sales means specifically, what it means for states like Connecticut, if you can buy online. And I think also Florida was mentioned too. So Albert, if you wanted to just re-answer live for us some of those questions, that would be great. And I know you mentioned you had slides. If it's helpful to show that to folks too, feel free to do that. But yeah, just go for it with answer.
Yeah, sure. My slides were pretty general, high level. So I don't know that they would add much to this question of what, but there may be an opportunity to show one or two of them. The difference between a direct sale and selling through the franchise system is basically that historically manufacturers of motor vehicles have sold through franchise dealers, and that goes back to the middle of the last century. So between the 30s and the 50s, state laws started to spring up basically around how vehicles can be sold in a particular state, because Ford and GM had opted to sell through franchise dealers. So they wholesale vehicles to local franchise dealers who then sell at retail to customers. There was the franchise agreements were negotiated between the local dealers and the big manufacturers. And the middle of last century, GM was the largest and most profitable company in the whole world. So they had a significant bargaining advantage over any particular local dealer. So franchise laws were created to basically even out that bargaining imbalance. So they included a lot of protections for local dealers. Like, for instance, Ford couldn't force them into onerous contract terms by threatening to never sell them another car, which would put them out of business. One of the provisions that was put into place pretty much everywhere was that Ford and GM could not set up a company-owned store to sell directly and compete with their franchise dealers in a particular state, because they would have a number of advantages, pricing, and they could really sort of bully them around if they did that. So that's really that's the franchise law. Each state has a really, really long, really dense franchise law that governs the relationship between a franchisee and a franchisor. And occasionally they've been sort of applied to companies like Tesla, who are not operating through a franchise agreement with franchise dealers. But the dealers obviously would prefer that we did that, and prefer that we didn't sell directly in a state. We think that there are advantages. I mean, I mentioned some of them with regard to electric vehicles, but also, everything is negotiable at a franchise dealership, because their ability to generate profit is really kind of dependent on their ability to add margin above what they paid wholesale for the car, and they do that in the negotiation over purchase price. They do that. They can add to the interest rate that a purchaser is offered from a bank, like you may not realize it, but when the dealer says, here's your financing rate, they may be adding 2.5% to that interest rate, and they keep that income. There's a lot of stuff that is kind of hard to understand in the franchise dealer purchase process. But the average dealer loses money on each new car sale, but they make 50% of their profit on repair, service, stuff like that. They make a lot on the financing markups that I mentioned. So having that franchise layer in between the manufacturer and the customer was not something that was attractive to us as a distribution model. And we think it's been a popular innovation in the distribution system. People generally like knowing exactly what they're going to pay for a product and not having to negotiate it. So that's the important distinction there. And sorry, a state like Florida has allows manufacturers that don't have franchise dealers to sell directly, which was the case in New York prior to 2014. So that's why we've got 16 stores there.
Thanks, Albert. Thank you for filling us in on all of that. For the next one is more directed towards Carine. Could you elaborate on slide 6 specifically, where you talk about traditional rates that don't account for the unique load profile of electric vehicle charging?
Yes, I can, and I'm gonna try not to be too wonky here. So I think the message that I was trying to say is that demand charges end up being a significant portion of electricity costs, which ends up skewing the effective rate for the power. Essentially, what happens is that in traditional commercial and industrial for traditional commercial and industrial customer, those traditional rates, you've got a number of elements that are part of that. I was particularly speaking about the demand charge that ends up being a significant portion of this because those traditional rates essentially, actually, let me back up a second. The question was about load profile. I think I was highlighting the fact that DC fast charging is different than a traditional, let's say, building or a large building. In that sometimes the load can be a little bit more spiky, where things with rates become the issue here is that. Because fast charging equipment can draw peak demand for portions of an hour, for lower utilization chargers, demand charge can significantly skew that nominal rate, and you end up with a skewed effective dollar per kilowatt hour rate. And so what this bill would do is that it would convene, or at least the utilities would be able to propose different rates that would address that issue, and hopefully. There is, as part of those discussions, there would be an opportunity to evaluate different rates, for example, that would account for how much a customer utilizes of the system by considering different load factors. So a DC fast charger would have a different load factor, let's say, than a large building. And so figuring out how to develop rates that account for that uniqueness is going to be important, and I think that's what this bill really calls upon. It's not specific about what needs to happen in terms of specific rate design. I think I shared in my presentation some examples of how it's been dealt with in many other states. So there are lots of lessons learned to address the issue of rate design, and we've seen that not only in places like California, but certainly in the Northeast, like in Connecticut, New Jersey, and in places like, even Florida or Wisconsin.
Thanks, Carine. And yeah, that it is very complicated. As one of our questions, we had a question about, walking folks through the rate design issue. I think, you covered it nicely there, but there is a lot to learn about rate design, and as we electrify not only our transportation, but our buildings, rate design is something we're really going to have to tackle so that we can incentivize electrification and not punish early adopters. So let's jump around. So we're giving some questions and love to all of our panelists. So a more recent question about green jobs. Does the Green Jobs Bill bind or encourage or incentivize county IDAs, which is industrial development agencies, to give preference to green projects when they decide which economic development projects to support? And if not, is there a way to make it so? So this would be for Rachel or Mo-Yain.
I guess I'll jump in first then. So the way the Green Jobs Bill works, it's actually involves the direct contract between the transit agency and the manufacturers. And so that's where the accountability tool is. It's in the contract that's awarded, and it creates a legally binding contract that way. So IDAs would be outside of that. But as we all know, they're part of the process of like encouraging manufacturers to come to a state. And so that's a different layer of accountability, but that would be outside of this specific bill. But it would highlight that issue, I'm sure, especially if they commit to saying, we would build this facility here if you award this contract, then that conversation would probably open up. But the bill itself wouldn't address it.
Okay, thanks. And I guess that just a follow up on the Green Transit Bill. Would that include funding for marketing of public transportation to encourage people to use buses instead of their cars?
That's a great idea, but the bill only specifies that funding would come through the transportation capital plan. So, you know, I believe it's 5 years, transportation authorities get funding through the Department of Transportation to run their authorities and agencies, and it would be through that fund. So I'm not sure if they have any specific, you know, mandates or programs to encourage public transportation, but as advocates, you know, that's something we're always interested in.
Absolutely, especially with the pandemic, seeing a lot less riders. It's important to encourage people to support public transportation.
Yeah, we need to start finding creative ways of getting around for sure. There's another question. I think that, let me see who this could be directed to. How the different components of an electric bill impact operating costs, perhaps differentiating between the different components of an electric bill. I wasn't sure if maybe that was for Carine or maybe that was during the presentation piece and it's not so clear.
Okay, well, an easier question. Does this include school buses? No, right?
No, so yeah, just to clarify, so school buses are procured and run through school districts and through the schools themselves, actually. And transportation authorities are like the city buses you see. So unfortunately, they are two different systems. But school buses is definitely an issue that we need to tackle. And advocates have been suggesting that we do need some kind of statewide legislation to coordinate school buses as well as public transportation.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for answering the simpler question. This is another one, how these bills might work with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and the working groups. I think that could probably be for all of the bills, but maybe looking specifically at the Green Transit, Green Jobs ones.
Sure, I don't know how to address that entirely, but you know, the Climate Action Council was mandated by the CLCPA. They're a body of experts who are spending the next year really figuring out what the state needs to do and what direction we need to take. So they're looking at policies. They're also looking at market-based solutions. They're looking at regulatory strategies. So all of the things that we talked about today are actually exactly the kinds of solutions that we would like to see advanced and discussed. And some of these things are being discussed through the Climate Action Council networks. So we're hoping that with advocacy through watching those and engaging in public input sessions and advocating for this through the legislature, that we'll get some combination of these to pass through.
We had a couple of questions about EV charging. One was about why is New York so far behind, especially upstate? And another was on, why we have companies, like Tesla or Rivian, kind of coming up with their own chargers. And I'm summarizing here. But how can we have a better network so we're not having companies just deploy their stations for their own vehicles. So that's probably a question for Carine.
Sure. I don't know if I wanted to say something on the topic and I can jump in, but maybe I'll just quickly, to the point, I think this is a multi-pronged effort, achieving not only transportation electrification objectives, but also the climate objectives. And it's going to take, and it is taking a lot of time and effort and work and hard work from a variety of stakeholders. And certainly deploying fast charging infrastructure is a core element to that. And I think that, it is, there's certainly a lot more work to be done. And we're certainly very, excited to do our part and work with, I think, everyone here to try to advance those objectives and to be able to ensure that access to EV charging is, or the transition to an electric vehicle and access to EV charging, having access to EV charging is ubiquitous for all drivers. I think it's very important also from the perspective of public fast charging that residents of multi-unit dwelling who don't have access to a dedicated parking garage have charging available to them. So that it really becomes part of the integrated activities that they do day to day. And I think that facilitates that transition to an EV. But I don't know, Al, if you want to talk a little bit more about some of the details there, or you were going to say something?
Yeah, no, agree with all that. And I would say to the point about upstate. So I mean, as Carine's presentation highlighted, New York has relatively high non-coincident demand charges. So that's a problem anywhere, but particularly when you're building out the network into like second and third tier route enablement, where utilization rates are fairly low for a while, and it's sort of a chicken and egg problem, because you want to put charging in order to get people comfortable with buying an EV. But when utilization is low, the demand charge has a disproportionate impact on the price to charge each vehicle, the price to deliver power. So that's what the CUSIC bill would address. That's the best practice in the most dense EV markets around the country. To the question about connectors, I totally agree. It's a good policy goal to standardize. It would remove friction in the system, and I appreciate the way the question was phrased, which was a sort of, I think it showed an understanding of why companies have chosen to invest in their own charging networks, because going back a decade, we could not be dependent on third parties to go put charging where people were interested in buying cars. We needed to go do that ourselves. We actually lose a significant amount of money on our charging network. It's not a profit center for Tesla, quite the opposite. But it is essential to getting EVs on the road. And I think one reason why we have the system that we have now, we have had an offer to other manufacturers to use the network on a few conditions, like one being to share in the cost of building and operating the network proportional to their vehicle's usage. Another being, we've spent a significant amount of time trying to ensure that, first of all, 80+% of charging takes place where people park, and that's a huge part of policy development, both in urban and rural environments. So longer term things like building code development, but also shorter term things. I saw someone mention we cannot just rely on new buildings alone to create charging access. We need to ensure that we are putting charging where people live now, particularly focused on multi-unit dwellings. But we've focused on for the 10% of charging that takes place at DC fast chargers. And a lot of times it looms larger as a psychological barrier than it actually matters when you drive an EV. Like I've driven one for 4 years. I hardly ever use DC fast charging. Now that's because the places where I park at work and around where I live, there's charging availability. That's not the case in a lot of places in New York. So, but for the 10% that are using DC fast charging, we focus on trying to bring down the charging time. That's heavily dependent on the battery architecture. So to achieve the charging times we've achieved recently, that a lot of DC fast chargers out there and a lot of vehicles out there are limited to 50 kilowatts, whereas we're operating at 250 kilowatts. So it takes 5 times as long. It's not a linear comparison necessarily, but it takes a lot longer to charge. So that's part of the reason why we've said we want to make sure that the vehicles that are moving through these high-powered DC fast chargers are charging very quickly. But I think we're working with the rest of the industry on a long-term solution, and those conversations are ongoing.
Thanks. And we do have a couple of other charging questions, but I have one about the fleets, and it's about what the opposition is to having the bill kick in much sooner. 2022 is the question. Mo-Yain or Rachel?
I don't know if you want to start off, Mo-Yain, or you like me to. Okay. I was just gonna say. Oh, I'm getting a lot of feedback. I don't know if everyone else can hear that. Yeah, I'll let Mo-Yain go ahead.
Well, as Rachel mentioned, I'm also getting a weird feedback now. But yeah, there's the CLCPA goals, which I think are set at 2030 for reaching 80%, and then the 2050 goal of 100%. So the 2029 goal, it's just more, as we were saying earlier, allows for that phasing in period. I guess you're right, we could be aggressive, but it doesn't seem necessary considering the CLCPA standards that are set. And as we mentioned earlier, with the challenges we've encountered with existing transit agencies, and the cost and making sure that that's lined up, this gives us more time for that.
Okay, makes sense. So we'll wrap up, but just wanted to put in a couple other questions about chargers before we do. One was related to New York City. How can we, basically get more charging stations as we're doing away with free and other on-street parking to make way for public space. And the other question related to charging was about solar charging stations. So Carine or Albert, or actually anybody really who wants to speak to this, it would be great to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I can just quickly go ahead. Maybe I missed the first portion of the question, but with respect to solar, I think one of the things that there's a variety of considerations when you look at where to site charging stations. And as I mentioned, being able to provide access to public fast charging station for those who don't have access to at-home charging is important. And sometimes that has to, when they are placed in areas, you have to take into account sort of what you have around you. And sometimes that can have constraints on what you can have with the site. I don't know necessarily whether this was a question about solar, at home combined with charging, or if this was for DC public fast charging. But I think that, with respect to different technologies, in using those in conjunction with DC public fast charging, I think you have to really sort of take into account the the constraints of the site that you are developing, and sometimes that can be a little bit that can be limiting. And so, yeah, I think that's what I'll share about that.
Okay, thanks. And I don't know if anybody based in New York City could speak to this issue of getting more fast charging actually on the street rather than, in parking garages, which is where I think most chargers are found in the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Deploying fast charging infrastructure, it's you have to site it in, or you locate those utilizing a variety of factors, right? And I think it's certainly something that is very important, in making sure that there is not only greater access to those chargers, but also you can see them. I think it really also depends on the infrastructure that you have around you. Utility infrastructure, but also other types of infrastructure. So those are things that are factors and considerations into that. But ultimately, I think with respect to, with respect to DC fast charging, and I think to a certain extent, yeah, for DC fast charging, I do think that the more you can, it's very important that those are available for those who don't have dedicated parking garage. So sometimes that can be challenging in certain areas, but there are solutions.
Okay, thank you. And any last words from any of our other panelists? I don't know whether, Mo-Yain, you want to give a plug for using public transportation in New York City instead of EVs, but just wanted to open it up if there are any last words in our remaining few minutes.
Well, that's why I live in the city active. It is that access, and that's why the Green Jobs, Green Transit Bill is something we want every city to benefit from. Right?
Good plug. Okay, and we will follow up for sure. We'll be sending, Mick put in the chat the great letter that people can easily send to support the green transit, green jobs bills. And then of course we have our form. If you would like to join our grassroots lobbying effort to push for all of these bills to get past this session, would love to hear from you. So please fill out that form, and then we can organize some group meetings and reach out to our legislators. And Mick put another link in just so it's right there in the chat. And yeah, we'll be in touch with the recording and PowerPoints and any other follow-up info that you might need. So thanks so much for joining. Mick, anything I'm forgetting?
No, you covered everything. So we'll see everyone next time.
All right, thanks so much for joining. Thanks to all of our speakers and all of our attendees. Take care.